Tomorrow morning, you will wake up, check your phone, and somewhere on that screen will be a border, a line on a map, a boundary between here and there, between us and them. You won't think about it. You never do. But what if you woke up tomorrow and every single one of those lines was just gone? Not moved, not redrawn, gone. Every border on Earth, every fence, every checkpoint, every wall vanished overnight as if they never existed. Most people hear that and they think one thing: chaos, war, the end of everything civilized. But here's what nobody tells you. We've already run this experiment. Not in a simulation, not in a thought experiment, in real history with real people, and the results were nothing like what you'd expect. Let's start with something most people don't know. Borders, as we understand them today, are not ancient, they are not natural, they are not inevitable. For most of human history, they simply did not exist. The modern concept of a fixed, enforced, internationally recognized national border is roughly 350 years old. It comes from a single peace agreement signed in 1648 in the German region of Westphalia, ending 30 years of war that had killed nearly a third of Central Europe's population. Before that treaty, the idea that a line drawn on a map could permanently separate sovereign territories with fixed populations was largely foreign to how humans organized themselves. Before Westphalia, you had kingdoms and empires with fuzzy, contested, shifting edges. You had city-states. You had tribal territories that overlapped and blurred. You had zones of control, not lines of separation. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans moved. They followed food, water, and warmth. The idea that a person could be illegal in a place simply because of where they were born would have been incomprehensible to every human who ever lived about 1800. So the question isn't really what would happen if borders disappeared. The question is what happened the last time they did. In 1985, 5 European countries signed the Schengen Agreement in a small Luxembourg village called Schengen. The idea was simple and at the time considered dangerously radical. Remove all border controls between member states. No passports, no checkpoints, no papers. Just drive across, just walk across, just exist on either side of the line as if the line wasn't there. Critics said it would collapse, crime would pour across, terrorists would move freely, economies would be overwhelmed by migration. The whole thing would unravel within years. Today, 29 countries are part of the Schengen area. More than 400 million people live inside it, and the predicted catastrophe never came. What came instead was something quieter and more profound. People moved, yes, but they moved for work, for family, for love, for opportunity. They built lives in new places. They sent money back home. They opened businesses. They filled jobs that local populations couldn't fill. The economies of Schengen countries didn't collapse. They grew. But Schengen is still a controlled experiment. It's 29 countries that agreed to do this together, with shared legal systems and decades of political alignment. What happens when you take it further? What happens when you remove borders not between allies, but between everyone? Here is where it gets strange. Economists have been running the numbers on this for decades, and the results are almost impossible to believe. A 2011 paper by economists Michael Clemens, Claudio Montenegro, and Pritchett calculated the wage gap between identical workers doing identical jobs in different countries. A construction worker in the United States earns roughly 7 times what an identical construction worker in El Salvador earns. Not because the American worker is smarter, not because they work harder, but purely because of which side of a line they were born on. This Clemens called the place premium. The single largest determinant of your lifetime earnings is not your education, not your effort, not your talent. It is the country you were born in, and that country was not chosen, it was assigned. So when economists model what would happen if labor could move freely across all borders, the numbers they get are staggering. Some estimates suggest that fully open borders would roughly double world GDP, not grow it, double it. The economic case for open borders, purely on numbers, is one of the strongest cases in all of economics, and almost nobody talks about it. But economics is the easy part. Here is what actually happens to human identity when borders disappear. In 1990, Namibia gained independence and became one of the last African nations to
be freed from colonial rule. When the new government drew its internal administrative boundaries, they made a decision that seems small but wasn't. They drew the lines to cut across tribal territories instead of following them. The intention was to prevent any single ethnic group from dominating a region. The effect was something stranger. People whose entire identity had been built around tribal membership suddenly found themselves living in administrative units that mixed them with neighbors they had previously defined themselves against. And slowly, over years, new identities began to form. Not tribal, not national exactly. Something new, built from the mixture. This is not unique to Namibia. It is the pattern that appears almost everywhere humans are forced to actually live together, instead of being separated by lines. The United States is the largest experiment in this kind of forced mixture in history. Hundreds of millions of people from every ethnicity, language, religion, and culture on Earth, crammed together inside one set of borders, legally required to share the same roads, the same courts, the same money. And yes, there is conflict, enormous conflict. But there is also something that did not exist before, something that has no name in any older language because it had never existed before. An American, not an ethnicity, not a tribe, a new category of human identity built entirely from proximity, from shared institutions, from the friction of living next to people who are nothing like you and somehow surviving it. If every border on Earth disappeared tomorrow,
this process would accelerate violently, chaotically, and irreversibly. Here is the part nobody wants to say out loud. The greatest threat of open borders is not crime, it is not terrorism, it is not economic collapse. The greatest threat is to the story you tell yourself about who you are. Because borders don't just separate territories, they separate identities. They tell you who belongs and who doesn't. They give you a team, they give you a history, they give you enemies, which means they give you a self. Remove the lines and that self becomes unstable. If anyone can be here, what does here mean? If anyone can be us, what does us mean? This is not a small thing. Humans are the only species on Earth that will die for a symbol. We will walk into gunfire for a flag. We will starve ourselves for a principle. We will sacrifice our children for an idea written on a piece of paper centuries before any of us were born. Our capacity for symbolic loyalty is what built civilization. It is also what built every war in history. A world without borders is not a world without conflict. It is a world where conflict has to find new shapes, new lines to draw, new definitions of us and them, because the human brain does not know how to exist without those categories. We tried to remove them in controlled environments repeatedly, and what happened every time was that smaller lines appeared inside the larger ones, new hierarchies, new in-groups, new walls, invisible but just as real. And yet, here is what Calhoun missed in his mouse universe. Here is what the Westphalian architects couldn't have known. Here is what every theorist who has modeled this gets wrong. Borders were never really about territory. They were about meaning. They were the answer to a question that every human being who has ever lived has had to answer. Who am I and who are my people? The lines on the map were just one way of answering that question, and it turns out they are a remarkably crude way, a clumsy, violent, arbitrary way that assigns your entire identity based on where your mother happened to be standing when you were born. If the lines disappeared tomorrow, yes, there would be chaos. Yes, there would be conflict. Yes, there would be a period of terrifying instability that would last years, maybe decades. But on the other side of that chaos, the question would still be there. Who am I and who are my people? And for the first time in 350 years, we would have to answer it honestly, not with a passport, not with a flag, not with a line someone else drew on a map before you were born, with something real. The borders didn't create your identity. They just made it easier to pretend you already had one. And maybe that is the most uncomfortable truth of all. Not what would happen to the world if the lines disappeared, but what would happen to you.